Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. All right, welcome to today's episode.
Welcome, everyone. Hi, Jimmy.
Well, hello, Clara. I want to remind everybody a couple things. Okay, so this podcast is starting to pick up a little bit of momentum, but I would like to see it pick up more momentum because we do feel like this is impacting people for the good, and we don't spend our time just for the sake of doing it. This is a big time commitment for us. This is close to our heart. We enjoy doing the podcast, but we mostly do it because we want this to benefit other people. So if you feel like this is benefiting you, if you're one of the hundreds of people listening, or possibly thousands, you're listening to this, you enjoy it, or you think it's useful, smash that subscribe button and also share it, because we don't pay, because, well, we can't afford it. We don't pay to market this podcast. Okay, so this is all word of mouth. So we depend on people to subscribe. If you have an Android device, which I'm an Android user, my mom is...
I'm an iPhone user.
She hasn't yet seen the light, so she's an iPhone user. But whether you're Android or iPhone, go into either Google Play Music or Apple Podcasts and find our podcast. You can just type our names if you want. Clara Hinton, Jimmy Hinton. Find this podcast and subscribe to it so that your phone dings every time a new episode is uploaded. You'll know instantly. But also share it, and if you're so inclined, rate it as well. Give us a rating and let us know if you like it. So, anyway, we're going to get into this week's podcast, the subject matter. And last week we had referenced a book that I think is an absolutely must-have book. If you want to understand techniques that abusers use, and this is all different kinds of abusers, but that's Robert Cialdini's book, and you spell his last name, Cialdini. I put it in the comments section of the podcast last week. I'll do that again this week. And the book is called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. What I like about this book is Cialdini lays out 6 basic principles that influence people, that cause people to be persuaded. Now, you can use these like anything else. You can use these for good, or you can use these for harm. Advertisers, that's debatable, I guess, but they use it, I guess, for good because they're selling product. But abusers, they're using this for bad because they're abusing victims.
And this is so important for everybody to listen to because we all fall prey to this kind of, I'll call it manipulation.
Mm-hmm. Psychological manipulation.
Right.
Yeah.
And we often don't realize it. And this brings a keen awareness to us as to how we fail to see abuse going on, number one. And number two, how the abuser gets away with the abuse.
Yeah.
So it's critical that we learn these techniques, that we study them, that we're aware of this information.
So Cialdini says that, there are hundreds or thousands of different branches of manipulation, or persuasion, whatever you want to call it. But he says, when you boil it all down, these are the 6 foundational principles that never change. everything else is built on these 6 principles. So if you understand these 6 principles, and I'm a simple-minded person, so I don't like to memorize lists and lists and lists. People ask me that all the time. They're like, can you just send me an exhaustive list of things that I need to be looking for? Well, I don't have such a list. I don't want to produce such a list.
Right.
Because that list would be endless.
Right.
So I think it's more practical to understand foundations, to understand at the most foundational level, what are these principles of persuasion that create compliance? And that's Cialdini's big thing. These things create compliance within people. And it's an automatic response that we may even feel like we're being manipulated, but these principles are so powerful that in the majority of people, they create compliance. What I love about this book is that at the end of each chapter corresponds to these 6 principles. At the end of each chapter, he basically tells you how to counter these principles. Once you identify these principles and somebody's pulling this garbage on you, how do you counter that?
And that's vital to those of us who are in this fight against child sexual abuse or any kind of abuse, as you mentioned, Jimmy. But,
yes.
It is just vital to us to know these principles and to know how to counter them.
So we're going to do 3 of his 6 principles this podcast, and then the next podcast we'll do the remaining 3. So we're going to split it up into 2 parts because I don't want to gloss over this. I think these are really important to break them down one by one. So persuasion technique number 1 is reciprocity. Reciprocity. So the principle is this. We feel obligated to pay back someone who offers us a gift, and that makes us more likely to comply with subsequent requests. So all they have to do is give us one little thing, whether it's a gift or a compliment or whatever it is, and we feel obligated to reciprocate that. What's important is this. From the perspective of the abuser, when we reciprocate, they know that they have us hooked.
Absolutely.
And that's important.
Absolutely.
I can't overstate that.
And this is a very basic principle, but one every one of us can understand. If I do something nice for you, Jimmy, you're going to want to do something nice for me back.
And I feel obligated
and
to do
that.
Like there's turmoil, right. There's inner turmoil.
There is.
Where I'm like, and he uses examples of giving cards.
Right.
There's a professor who did an experiment, a college professor who did an experiment. He gives this example in this chapter. And he said he wanted to see what would happen if I just write random people Christmas cards. I think it was Christmas cards. Drop them in the mail. And he found the addresses, I don't know, in a phone book or whatever.
Sure.
So he writes the person's name, addresses it to these random people he had no idea who they were. So he writes them by name and writes a personal note in these Christmas cards and mails them off just to see what would happen. I forget what the percentage was, but it was a very high percentage of these people wrote him a handwritten card back.
Absolutely.
They mailed him a card back.
Number 1, most of us are starving for some kind of attention.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, when somebody shows us that attention, it makes us feel really good,
mm-hmm.
and we want to do what? We want to give that back
mm-hmm.
in return. It's an automatic...
And you feel guilty if you don't. And that's important
guilty.
To understand. This is a
really
powerful principle.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful principle. Well, he talked about being at an airport, and the Krishnas were in the airport, and he noticed that there were people handing out, I think they were roses, some kind of a flower, but I think he said they were roses. And so they're handing them out to people, just people walking by in the airport. Well, then he looked and he said farther down from those people were these contribution kettles, like what the Salvation Army has. And he noticed that the people who had the rose in their hand, he said some of them he would actually see walk past the kettle, and they would pause, they would stop. And so he's watching this unfold, and he's like, it was really this fascinating thing to watch this unfold right in front of your eyes, because you could see the turmoil where they were conflicted. And they would turn around, and he said, even if begrudgingly, even if they were just ticked off and they knew that they had been had, they still put money in the kettle.
I shared with Jimmy a few minutes ago that I did the same thing while on a trip abroad. I was in the middle of a busy area, hundreds and hundreds of people. Someone's handing out flowers. I got a flower. I felt special because 3, 4, 5 people around me didn't get a flower. Unknown to me, when I received the flower, about 3 minutes later, along comes somebody and they have their hand out. They wanted, a gift in return. What did I do? Well, of course, I'm holding the flower next to me. I'm smelling the flower. I love it. I feel special. I gave some money. Why not?
Yeah.
No sweat off my back. Made me feel good to be able to do that.
Well, what was fascinating about the Krishnas, he said, very quite by accident, he happened to follow one of the ladies who had handed out all the roses.
Okay.
And so she took off walking. Well, he happened to see her find a garbage can. And she pulls the lid off and she starts reaching inside. And he was like, well, this is kind of interesting. So he watches. So here the people who had taken the flowers, they put a donation inside the kettle, and then they discard the roses, and the Krishnas would go back into all the garbage cans. They would get the flowers back, and they would just go right back to it. Yep, they were reusing them.
Okay.
And he's like, this is a fascinating principle, and it's so powerful. So, a couple different avenues with that. He said, when you offer something that's personalized, it makes this effect even more powerful. So you personalize the gift. But the important thing about the principle of reciprocity is that you give the gift first. Right. So if you want something in return, if you want to hook somebody, you be the first person to initiate that. So he said this becomes even more powerful a principle if you offer something that's personalized. Another thing that makes it powerful is you offer small gifts that remind them of you. So it doesn't have to be anything expensive. It doesn't have to be anything powerful. A dumb card that you just drop in the mail. It's just something that reminds them of you.
Like I said, a card is something that it signifies somebody spent the time for you to, especially if there's a little handwritten note inside.
Or $1 inside. I think about that at church.
Right.
People that give us cards in the mail.
Yeah.
I always have this massive guilt. If I get busy and I don't send a card in return, but thank you card.
Yes.
Like, most people are fine with a verbal thank you. They're not looking for something in return. Unless you're an abusive person, you're not looking for something in return. They don't do it to receive thanks. When I give gifts, I don't give gifts and expect thanks in return.
I don't ever. But you're not an abusive person, nor am I.
Yeah.
When I think back to how your dad worked the crowd, so to speak, he did things like bake a pan of brownies. For him, it was you go to the store, you buy $1 box of brownie mix, and you bake it, but you bring it to a family where the mom is stressed, where there's kids there that would love something home baked, and he's got you hooked immediately. He's this kind, awesome, wonderful man who took time out of his life to do that for you. You're never going to forget that, and you're always going to want to do something to make him feel good.
One thing that I remember people saying to him, man, you're just always helping other people. What can we do for you?
Sure.
That's reciprocity.
Yes,
that's this principle of reciprocity.
Perfect example. Wonderful, perfect example.
So a couple other things within reciprocity. Don't give over-the-top gifts. You don't give elaborate, big, exaggerated gifts. You just give little gifts. And then, the next principle within this is tit for tat. So you offer You offer first, and then you reciprocate. The other person will reciprocate exactly what was given back, and then you reciprocate. And so you continue that cycle. So you keep this going, but you can build it into bigger and bigger. And so people talk about grooming. Mm-hmm. This is grooming at its most raw level, where they're intentionally increasing the level of quote unquote gifts, and eventually, whether they want to or not, they're sending their kids and shipping them off to the abuser's house overnight.
They don't even know why.
Yeah.
They don't know why, except here's this nice person who doesn't have the money but bought my kids a gift from the Dollar Tree, who doesn't have the time but went ahead and baked that pan of brownies, who is tired at the end of the day but answered my phone call when I called. And of course you feel obligated, and along with that, you would never speak ill of that person. That person is special to you. And you want to do in return. You're absolutely right.
And then finally, it works in unfair exchanges as well. So the person can ask for something really big. When you're reciprocating something back to the abuser, they can actually ask you for something. So it doesn't have to be that you just naturally reciprocate. They can actually ask you. And I remember Dad doing things like that. I was going to say, he would come and volunteer, like splitting wood at my house. He would spend hours and hours at my house helping me out. But then he would make little comments like, "Hey, can I ask a favor of you?" Yeah. And what he was doing, and I remember him doing this often. Yeah. He would ask for something that was so outrageous that I was like, "No, I don't have the time, or I don't have the money, or whatever it is." But then he would negotiate down and be like, "Okay, well, how about if you help me with this?" Yep. What's interesting is Cialdini talks about that, and he said that's a very, very, very precise technique that salesmen use, because what they're doing is they know that you actually feel relief whenever they give you a lesser demand, and not only will you do it, you're happy to do it. You're excited to do it because your mind,
something.
And your mind had this big, great thing in mind that you were perplexed, and you were kind of anxious inside because, there's no way that I can help you with this. But then they give you something smaller, and you're like, well, yeah, that I can help you with. And you're actually excited about it. I asked you for
$5,000. I desperately needed help for something that was coming up, and I needed $5,000. And you said, I just
there's no way, I don't have the money.
And you're feeling horrible because we've built this relationship now, and we love each other, and you're my friend, and I'm your friend, and all that. But then I say, you know what? Oh man, I know you can't help me with $5,000, but $500 would really get me through this pitch.
Or a tank of gas.
Or
you know what? My car's on empty right now, and I can't even afford to put any gas in my car. And it would help me so much. Absolutely. You'll follow them to the gas station, or buy them gift cards,
you're going to do it, but you're going to end up feeling so bad that you couldn't do the full gift, that the next time you're asked, you're going to do right. You're going to say to yourself, you know what? The next time if something comes up, I'm going to be there.
I'll be there by your side. I'll be there to help you.
Yep.
Whatever you need.
Right. And this is, Jimmy and I have seen it work in with his dad, within families, within the church, over and over again, within our own family, over and over and over again.
So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2 is commitment and consistency. So the first one is reciprocity. The second one is commitment and consistency. So people tend to stick with decisions that they previously made. So in other words, if I can get you to commit, and especially to commit publicly in front of other people, people you teach cessation, right?
Sure.
So here's how that principle works.
Okay.
Get people to say that they'll quit smoking in front of who?
In front of the group.
Yeah, in front of the group.
In front of our group.
You know that that's effective because people don't want to feel like a failure if they've made a public commitment.
Right. And I've had people say, if I say it out loud in front of the group, I'm really going to stick to it.
And oftentimes that works. Well, not always, but oftentimes that works.
They really struggle with that. Struggle to make it work.
But what happens is that's our wanting to be consistent. We just by nature want to be consistent people.
Well, I think you said the word too, we don't want to fail. And when we've made a commitment in front of someone else, we don't want to feel like a failure. If I make a promise to myself, I'm going to write 5 pages on this book every day for the next 30 days. I've made that commitment to myself. Nobody else knows about it. It's so easy for me to slack on that.
Yeah.
But if I have somebody that I'm accountable to, if I've said that in front of a group of writers, I'm going to do this, I feel like I need to do it. I need to carry through.
So he talked about telemarketers, which that's, I guess with the age of cell phones, that's not as common, as popular anymore, but it still does. But and it's a good example because he said what telemarketers do is, if you don't know that they're a telemarketer, they'll start the sentence out by just saying, "Hey, how are you doing today?" Well, fine.
It just happened to me today.
Yeah, I'm doing good.
Office.
And
just had it happen.
And so now you've made this public commitment. They've asked you a question. You've responded in kind. You're now committed to that conversation, and they know it. That's at that point, you're typically not going to hang up when it's revealed that they're a telemarketer. And so they'll start their little spiel and they want to tell you about this latest product and blah, 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 blah. And so they go through the whole thing and they're using some of these other principles. And by the end, you may be extremely annoyed with them, but by golly, you're committed.
I have a man, he's a salesman that calls me at the office wanting to sell his products. I already know when his number comes up on the caller ID who it is. I'll answer the phone. I can sound very perturbed because I know what's going to happen. He starts out by saying, "How is your weather in Somerset? I hope you're having a beautiful sunny day." Well, then he goes on a step further and he'll say, "I hope you get to enjoy some of that sunshine," or whatever the weather is. He makes it very personal to me. And the other day, last week, I purchased something from him. It was expensive. I was frustrated. In fact, when I hung the phone up, I just was so angry with myself and thought, why did I do that? I'll tell you why. Because he wished me and my family a beautiful 4th of July weekend and said, "I'll be thinking of you." He's not going to be thinking of me.
Right.
He's
exactly
not.
Right.
But I bought into it.
Well, this was interesting too because he gave the example of companies, and so I think Beanie Babies was one of the companies or something like that. But he said, the thing that they do is they get parents to commit. And once you commit, there's this need to be consistent, and companies know that. So here's what that looks like. They advertise Beanie Babies or Cabbage Patch Dolls. You said earlier. That was the big thing when I was a kid. The Cabbage Patch Dolls, they were the thing. Everybody, all of us wanted to have a Cabbage Patch doll. So they know that. They advertise that. They market and target the kids, not the parents.
Sure.
So they make it look like the biggest, coolest thing that kids just have to have, knowing that the kids are going, "Mommy, I want a Beanie Baby. I want a Beanie Baby for Christmas."
Or I want Santa to bring me.
Yeah, I want Santa to bring my Beanie Baby. The parent commits. The parent says, "Okay, Santa will bring it, or whatever." The companies, without ever having met any of the parents, know that the parents commit to that. And then magically, about a month or 5 weeks before Christmas, all of a sudden the stores are what? They're sold out.
They're depleted.
They undersupply
There's
them.
No Beanie Babies,
That's
no
right.
Cabbage Patches available.
So what they do is the kids are still screaming. They want their Beanie Baby. You don't want to be the bad parent because you committed and told them you were going to get them the Beanie Baby.
Of course.
So then the companies, they put out a knockoff version. It's the same companies, and it might be branded under a different company name, but the parent company puts out a lesser product. You buy that hoping and knowing that you're not going to get by, but you're hoping to get by.
I know I fell into that trap.
And
I did
so you buy the lesser product from the same company, and then after Christmas is over, magically the stores are just full of Beanie Babies. So what do the parents do?
Go buy another one.
They go buy an actual Beanie Baby because the kids are crying because Santa messed up the order.
Absolutely. Now, the question is, how do you apply this to abuse?
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty simple because they, abusers, they'll ask you to commit to anything, and it can be anything small, like just saying, "Hey, can I watch your kids? Can I spend time with your kids?" If you say yes to that, it doesn't have to be right in that moment. It doesn't even have to be anything scheduled. You've already committed to that, and so they're going to follow up. And they're going to say, "Hey, remember when you said, I could spend time with your kids? We can hang out, or I can take them to the park, or whatever it is." That principle of commitment and consistency is such a powerful principle that you're gonna comply. So we need to be careful whenever making commitments to really think through those, even if it's the tiniest little commitment. We've got to really, really think through that before we say yes. And so I think a good answer to tell people, if we're unsure of something is, let me think about that. Let me get back to you.
And Jimmy, the abuser has kind of like the upper hand on this, because it's natural for us to feel weird or wrong somehow about saying, "You know what, let me think about this." When someone has befriended you, you've now gained trust in this person, you've given each other these gifts, albeit, they could be as small as, like you said, a card, and you reciprocate with a card, or they make a pan of brownies, you make a pan of brownies, give them back. Now this person says, "You know what? Your kids are just the nicest kids, the most well-behaved kids. You are so, bogged down here. Let me take them out. Just an hour. We can run up to McDonald's and let the kids play on the playground." How many of us would really say, "Let me think about it"? Not many.
Yeah, not many at all.
Not many. You're going to say, "Well, I don't know. Let me pay for the McDonald's. Let me do that at least."
Well, I think the reason we don't say, "Let me think about it," is because of the fear of being inconsistent, and so that's why it's so powerful that those two go together, commitment and consistency.
There you go.
We don't want to be considered a flake. We don't want to be somebody who, or portrayed as somebody who goes back on their word. And so in our mind, we're like, let your yes be yes and your no be no.
Yeah.
And we've been taught that, especially as Christians. Let your yes be yes and your no be no.
And we've been taught to trust people, to believe them. We all do that instinctively. We believe people. We take them at their word, so to speak.
Yeah. So the final principle that we're going to cover today, this is the third one, and that is social proof. So people tend to trust in things that are popular or endorsed by people who look like us. So we had talked about this a little bit last week, but we're going to flesh it out a little bit more this week. So advertisers will use things using the social proof principle, like fastest growing, most popular. And what advertisers have discovered is that we as the consumer don't need to know that it's good. We don't need to know that their product is good. If you notice, when they advertise things, they don't talk about how good their product is. They talk about how popular it is. Because by default, we assume that because something is popular, that it's good. But it's not just popularity. It's popularity among people who look like us. And that's really important for this principle.
Extremely important for us to grasp.
And so where this is really powerful with the abuser is the idea of pluralistic ignorance. And that was something else that we had briefly talked about last week, but that's also known as the bystander effect. So pluralistic ignorance is when you have a whole group of people within a social context, and those people are, they become ignorant because of the behavior of the first person who walks into a certain scenario, and they behave a certain way, and so everybody else just sheepishly follows that first person's example.
Whether they want to or not.
Exactly right. So, what's interesting about this for me is that this technique or this principle is most powerful when this condition is introduced, and that is the condition of uncertainty. So, if you can introduce uncertainty into a group, if you can, whether that's confusion, whether that's just kind of misunderstanding or even just questioning something, if we have that moment of hesitation, we're far more likely to follow the group and to become sheeple within that social context.
Now, what we need you to do, Jimmy, is to put this in the setting of an abuser. Make sense out of this for everyone. You get it, I get it, but not everybody might be getting it. Yeah,
so one of the things that I see is on the back end of whenever there are allegations that arise with an abuser, we automatically assume that somebody who's guilty is going to become defensive. That's not what abusers do. Their first response is not to become defensive. Their first response is to introduce uncertainty within a group of people. Not so much individually, though they do that. But if they can introduce uncertainty within a group, within a social group, within a church, within a leadership structure, whatever it is, if they can introduce just a little bit of uncertainty within that group and say, well, my goodness, I can't believe that somebody would mistake what I was doing as abuse. If they can introduce just a little bit of uncertainty and then get somebody to have sympathy towards them, get that first person who looks like everybody else, and they're going to pick somebody who looks like everybody else in the group. They're not going to pick the person who stands out. They're not going to pick the dominant church leader. They're not going to pick somebody who stands...
So critical that we get this. This uncertainty principle is really that critical because it makes everything on our minds go kaflooey. Mm-hmm. We doubt ourselves then. Did we really see that? Did we really hear that? Mm-hmm. Did my child really feel that? Did it really happen? Was it their imagination? Were they taking something, just that pat on the shoulder and thinking that hand moved someplace else? Really? Would this person really do it? And on and on and on it goes.
Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, Larry Nassar did it. Jerry Sandusky. Sure. Think of all these abusers. Think of every single public figure. Notice the pattern. They all introduce an element of uncertainty. And they all do it. And it's very effective, and that's why they do it. It's not by accident that they all do it. It's very practiced, it's very rehearsed, and they know that works. Because if you introduce a little bit of uncertainty within a social group, then you can get... All you have to do is get that first person in that moment of uncertainty to think a certain way about you. To think that, my goodness, he would never abuse these kids. He would never do that. The rest is history.
And keep in mind that we're talking about a person who has been manipulating yourself, your children, the group for a long time now. This person knows the next move before it's made. And so now this idea of uncertainty creeps in. And you are sitting there thinking, I don't know how I could even have thought that he would do that to a child, not this person.
Well, I see it all the time. When I consult with churches, that's where I really see it. Because what they'll do is they'll come back inevitably after someone in the group, and it doesn't matter who it is, because the abuser knows who to target. So, I'll say that out front. They know who to target within that group. But after the abuser has spoken with one of the people who I consulted with, or just another member within the congregation, that has influenced, and I see it happen time after time after time, that's influenced the whole church as a group.
Absolutely.
And they become sympathetic towards the abuser. And parents who were once outraged and, there were these allegations and they want blood and they want to figure out what's going on. I mean, this can happen quickly within a matter of hours. Those same parents come back and they feel bad for ever having thought that about this alleged abuser.
And then the focus becomes on the person who made the accusation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it sounds like, is an accusation
Mm-hmm.
and not the truth. Which makes it so hard for people to come forward and speak the truth. Because there is that fear of being pointed at and saying, you brought an accusation out that wasn't true.
Mm-hmm.
And the abuser knows this.
So how does social proof look like before anybody suspects them of abuse? Well, that's pretty important too, because what they'll start doing is, just by nature of them babysitting people's kids and getting people to comply, getting parents to comply, having kids over at their house for sleepovers, things like that, that paves the way naturally for other people who look like those parents, other parents who look like the parents who are sending their kids over to the house, for them to do the same thing. They're just naturally compliant because of this principle, because of social
my friends are doing, my friends' kids are going over there. Why shouldn't I send my kids? My friend's kids had a ball going swimming with him. Why shouldn't I let my kids? My kids are begging to go too. He's a super guy. We know him. We trust him. We love him. And that's how it's done.
What's interesting, there was something that really jumped out within this chapter, and he said after suicides are publicized, and this seems like kind of he's chasing a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think he's onto something. After high-profile suicides are publicized, they're national news, airplane crashes increased by 1,000% in the following days. Now, I thought he was full of it. I thought he was absolutely full of it. And so I went back and started looking at highly publicized suicides. So Robin Williams, you have people like that who they're huge public figures. They commit suicide, and if you look in the following days, up to maybe a couple months after, you see a dramatic increase in airplane crashes.
We shake our heads and say this is crazy. Not so. That's just how our minds work.
Well, what's interesting is his theory behind it. And he says that what he suspects is that whatever direction society is moving in as a whole. Mm-hmm. So we're influenced by each other, people who look like us. Greatly. So whatever's influencing people to commit suicide, maybe also influencing other people. And he said whether it's distractions or making people angry or just agitable, whatever it is, he said whatever's influencing one part of society may be distracting a whole other part of society. And so he said it's not just plane crashes, it's also automobile crashes.
I'm sure
they
car
increase.
Crashes, sure.
Car crashes increase after suicides.
Makes sense.
Highly publicized suicides. So it's kind of interesting, and whether there's a whole lot to that theory, I don't know, but I just found that to be interesting. But I want to end with this statement. In that chapter, this jumped out too. He said, thus the most influential leaders are those who know how to arrange group conditions to allow the principle of social proof to work maximally in their favor. That's a powerful statement. I'm going to read that again. Thus, the most influential leaders are those who know how to arrange the group conditions to allow the principle of social proof to work maximally in their favor. That made the hairs on my body stand up, because I see this play out with abusers within the church social structure. They do it all the time. They arrange the group conditions to allow this principle of social proofing to work in their favor.
It's
and
frightening.
It's highly effective.
It really is.
Especially after allegations arise, but also before. I mean, they're constantly using this principle, but it is a powerful, powerful principle. So we're going to leave you with your truth bomb for the day, and it's just a simple truth bomb. It's nothing earth-shattering. I'm just going to tell you, go get this book.
And I think that's great. We need to do it.
Robert Cialdini. The book is Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. Trust me when I say this is a must-read. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of our podcast. We'll catch you next round. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.